Tonight we'll drift into a gentler Greece than the one you've read about. Not the Greece of shouting gods, flying sandals, or angry sea monsters. No, tonight we're going somewhere quieter. A place with warm olive groves, stone benches warmed by sunlight, and gossip whispered between nymphs with too much free time. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket. Let your shoulders drop just a little. Tonight, I'll tell you a sleepy little myth about Apollo. Yes, the god of music, prophecy, and that golden hair you just know he never washed himself. And how he, at one very specific point in eternity, ended up with a pet raven. And how, well, he really regretted it, but gently. If this calm journey helps you unwind, tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. There's no rush, just soft sandals on warm stone. Let's follow the trail together. Now, breathe in, and let's begin. Let me tell you something that rarely makes it into the official stories. The gods had downtime. Olympus wasn't all thunderbolts and dramas. There were long, lazy stretches where nothing happened. No wars, no punishments, no transformations into swans, just naps and nectar. And that's where our story begins. Apollo, the golden boy himself, was bored, and that's always a dangerous place for a Greek god to be. It was late spring, somewhere between a doomed love affair and an ill-advised poetry competition. The sun had risen precisely the way he liked. Slow, glowing, flattering. His lyre had been tuned by the muses. His curls were behaving. Even his toga was crisp like a pressed grape leaf. But he was restless. He wandered down from Olympus into Delphi, the sacred site where mortals came for wisdom. But today the temple smelled vaguely of burnt time and regret. That's because Feminoi, the latest oracle, had tried to make tea. Technically it was an herbal infusion, using things she claimed she found in a dream. The result? A pot of steaming murk that smelled like boiled socks dipped in laurel. Apollo sipped it, swallowed, immediately regretted his immortality. Lovely, he said politely. Feminoi beamed. Mortals always tried a little too hard around him. She wasn't a bad oracle, just enthusiastic. The visions came to her in bursts, usually while sneezing or during mid-meal. Yesterday she had predicted a flood in Athens, but it turned out to be a merchant with a leaky olive barrel. Still, Apollo didn't mind her company. It was her raven that bothered him. Yes, this is where the bird enters the story, or rather, stares at it. The raven sat perched on a beam above the shrine, jet black, beady-eyed, judgy. It had belonged to Feminoi's predecessor, an old oracle who claimed the bird could deliver visions to the gods themselves. Apollo had never asked for this feature. The raven cawed once, just one sharp, echoing note that made the amphorae tremble slightly. "I think it likes you," Feminoi said, pouring more of the tea. "I think it's plotting something," Apollo murmured, setting his cup very far away. And it was. Now here's the thing. Ravens in mythology are usually symbols of wisdom, or omens, or death, which is rather a lot for a bird that sounds like an old door hinge. This particular raven had seen too much. It had lived through 5 oracles, 1 temple renovation, and an unfortunate incident involving ambrosia and a sleeping priest. It was bored, clever, and dangerously observant, and it had decided Apollo was the most interesting thing around. That was mistake number 1, because Apollo, for all his light and music and laurels, had a temper like a cracked mirror. Beautiful, but unpredictable. And sometimes, when he got too proud of himself, the universe would quietly arrange a lesson. This raven was that lesson, wrapped in feathers, with absolutely no boundaries. Now back to the tea room. Feminoi, in her ever-earnest tone, asked Apollo if he might like to hear a fresh prophecy. He smiled. Certainly. She closed her eyes, breathed, and said, "The feathers that spy will crack the sky." She opened her eyes. Apollo blinked. The raven blinked back. "That doesn't rhyme," he said. "It did in my head." And then she sneezed. The moment passed. Apollo decided to leave. But as he turned, the raven dropped from the beam and landed, quite neatly, on his shoulder. It didn't caw, it didn't flutter, it just sat there, and he let it. No lightning, no trumpet, no divine proclamation, just a bored god and a bird with opinions. And so began the unfortunate partnership of Apollo and the raven, one feathered observer, one sunlit deity, a pair destined for mild irritation, whispered scandals, and more than one passive-aggressive message scratched into olive bark. As we leave the warm temple now, incense still curling into the rafters, and a pot of unfortunate tea cooling quietly on the hearth, let your mind drift to where they might go next, because this is only the beginning, and trust me, the bird isn't done yet. Apollo wasn't used to being followed. Worshipped, yes. Painted on pottery? Often. Asked to pose with fruit? Frequently. But followed? That was new. The raven had taken to perching on his shoulder like it was born there, occasionally switching to his lyre case, or sitting directly atop his head like a bad hat with an attitude. Apollo tried everything. Gentle nudges, firm words, subtle divine suggestions involving lightning. But nothing worked. The bird simply blinked at him, tilted its head, and let out a low caw that sounded suspiciously smug. He even tried bribery. He scattered pomegranate seeds. Nothing. He conjured an entire roast fig glazed with nectar. The raven looked at it, then looked at him as if to say, "Really?" Eventually Apollo gave up and named it. He called it Koro. It means watch in a very old dialect no one uses anymore, which felt fitting because that's what Koro did. He watched everything. And then, worse, he started commenting. Not out loud. That would have been too easy. No, Koro had this way of squawking at just the right moment, usually when Apollo was trying to say something wise or poetic. Like that time in the olive grove when he was telling a muse that the stars were reflections of his greatness, and Koro let out a perfectly timed belch caw that made it sound like even the bird was done with him. Or the time he was composing a hymn on a reed flute, and Koro started mimicking it, off-key, deliberately. The muses laughed. Apollo did not. He tried to pretend it didn't bother him. He was a god, after all. God of music, sun, reason. What was one small, judgmental bird to a golden deity whose very hair shimmered like honey on polished marble? But then came the shrines. That's right. Mortals started building little bird shrines. Messenger of the god, they said. Sacred raven of prophecy, someone wrote. Someone else carved Koro's face onto a coin. That coin was accidentally used to buy leeks, but the damage had been done. Soon, pilgrims were arriving not just to worship Apollo, but to ask the bird for guidance, and Koro played along. Sometimes he'd caw once, sometimes twice, and people would gasp and fall to their knees. One merchant asked if his crops would thrive, and Koro pooped on his sandal. The man built a statue in his honor the next week. Apollo was livid. He cornered Koro by the Temple of the Laurel and said very calmly, "You are my pet. You are not divine. You are not to be consulted." Koro blinked, then turned his head slightly, then pecked at the laces of Apollo's sandals, not maliciously, just firmly, like a reminder. "I should turn you white," Apollo muttered. "I should turn you into a dove. See how you like that." Koro cawed loudly. Apollo flinched. Two passing priests nodded reverently and muttered something about the god's bird confirming wisdom. "This is madness," Apollo said to no one in particular. He tried escaping to Mount Helicon, hoping the mountain air and lack of altars would calm him. He brought his lyre, he brought grapes, he even brought a cushion, but Koro followed, and the worst part, Apollo had started talking to him. "Do you think I was too harsh?" he'd say. "She knew I had poetry to recite. I can't help it if she fell in love with someone mortal again." Koro would blink, sometimes tilt his head, other times cough up a small pebble he'd swallowed 3 days ago. "You're no help," Apollo would grumble. And yet, he kept talking. Perhaps it was the boredom. Perhaps it was the fact that the other gods were busy with their own chaos. Zeus was off chasing nymphs, Artemis had threatened to curse another hunter, and Hermes had recently invented socks. Whatever the reason, Apollo found himself speaking more and more to the bird. And occasionally, just occasionally, Koro seemed to understand. One night, while the stars hung low like shy lanterns, Apollo sat beneath a fig tree and said, "I think I miss being unknown." Koro said nothing, just hopped a little closer. Apollo sighed. "Don't tell anyone I said that." Koro cawed once, a quiet one, more like a hum. And then the two sat there, watching the moon ripple across a shallow stream, neither one needing to say anything. The next morning, of course, Koro stole Apollo's breakfast fig and flew 3 laps around the temple before dropping the half-chewed fruit on a priest's head. But still, something had shifted. The god who burned with pride and the bird who never blinked had found, not friendship exactly, but a kind of rhythm. Of course, it couldn't last, because soon Koro would deliver a message no one asked for, and things would never be the same. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, let your thoughts drift. Imagine feathers brushing warm marble, the scent of thyme and sun, a golden god and a black bird locked in silent bickering wandering through the lazy hours of eternity. Let it all grow soft and slow as we prepare for what comes next. By now, most of the villagers near Delphi had heard of the god with the bird. Some whispered about it over lentils. Others painted crude images of a sleek black raven perched beside golden curls. And a few got bold. That's how the olive merchant got involved. His name was Semos, and his beard was too long for his chin and too short for wisdom. He sold pressed olive oil, but only the kind that came from trees he personally argued with during pruning season. He believed in signs. He once saw a goat sneeze near a shadow and declared it a prophecy. So when he heard that Apollo's raven had taken to answering mortal questions, he packed his best bottle of oil, a satchel of fig cakes, and a scroll that included all of his life's burning inquiries. He didn't believe in asking just one thing. That would be wasteful. Apollo was lounging that day, not on a throne but on a warm, flat stone near the Temple of Artemis, basking like a very elegant lizard. Koro, of course, was nearby, perched on a sun-bleached statue of a muse whose nose had fallen off centuries ago, the perfect seat for a critic. Semos approached with reverence. "O radiant Apollo," he said, bowing so deeply he nearly dropped his scroll, "I bring questions and figs." "The figs may speak first," Apollo replied, without opening his eyes. Semos unfortunately took that as permission. He unrolled his scroll with great theatrical flair and cleared his throat. "Great god of light and, liars, I must know, should I marry Lisa or Arena? Which is better for olive yield, east-facing groves or west? And if I plant fennel near the fig trees, will the figs taste of soup?" Apollo blinked once. "Is that all?" "For now," Semos said, reaching for his second scroll. "No," Apollo said quickly, holding up a hand. "Ask the bird." Semos turned eagerly to Koro. "O feathered wisdom, guide me." Koro stared, then very deliberately flapped his wings twice. Semos gasped. "2 flaps!" He looked to Apollo. "That means west-facing groves, doesn't it?" Apollo shrugged. "Could mean you smell odd." Koro tilted his head, blinked, then pecked the statue's earless side. "It's a sign," whispered Semos. "I knew I should have gone with Arene." He dropped a fig cake at Koro's feet and shuffled away, mumbling to himself about fennel and love letters. Apollo waited until he was gone, then turned to Koro. "Why do you encourage them?" The raven made a low rattle, not a caw, more like a chuckle that hadn't decided whether it was worth finishing. Apollo sighed. "Next time, flap once, maybe they'll leave you in peace." Koro blinked. Apollo turned his face to the sun, but even he couldn't deny it now. Koro had become something more than a bird. He was a presence, a mirror, an irritant, a companion, and that was dangerous, because gods, despite their marble looks and divine brunches, were still prone to one very mortal weakness: projection. Apollo began to wonder if the bird actually understood him. And worse, he started treating him like he did. He spoke to him about Helios's bragging, about Hermes' irritating cleverness, about Artemis never laughing at his puns, and Koro never answered. Not really, just watched, flapped occasionally, left feathers in strange places like bookmarks in time. But one day, a message did arrive. Not from Koro, but through him. It came as a whisper, through an old priestess in a dream. She told Apollo, blinking through sleep, "The black wing brings more than shadow. Watch what you carry, for what watches you may carry it too." Apollo blinked. "That's vague," he said, "and dramatic." The priestess shrugged. "Dreams aren't known for clarity." The next morning, Koro brought him a pebble, perfectly round, smooth, not from Delphi, not from any known stream, just placed beside his lyre, like punctuation. Apollo didn't understand, but he kept it, placed it in a small pouch, and every now and then, when he was alone, he would reach for it, not because it told him anything, but because it reminded him that not all messages come in words. Some arrive feathered, some peck at your thoughts softly, and some just wait, quiet, watching, listening, ready to flap twice and change everything. And as the olive trees swayed in the warm breeze, and the fig cakes cooled on temple steps, and Koro blinked once, very slowly, Apollo realized something that made him uneasy. The raven wasn't his pet, and may never have been, but it was his now, for better or worse. So as we leave the olive merchant far behind, muttering to his trees and wondering if Irene likes soup, let your mind drift too. Past statues, past feathers, past the sun-glazed stones of Delphi, toward whatever waits quietly in the next part of the tale. There are two things Apollo was known to brag about more than anything else: his hair and his lyre. And while the first required little upkeep, sunlight, olive oil, and occasional dramatic wind, the lyre was a different story entirely, crafted from tortoiseshell and strung with golden strings plucked from the laughter of muses, or at least that's how he told it. The lyre was his pride, not just a symbol, but a voice. He often said, "If my words fail, my lyre will speak for me." Unfortunately, that's exactly what it did. One sleepy afternoon, Apollo returned to the temple gardens after a long walk, more of a strut, really, with Koro perched as usual on his shoulder. The sun was warm, the olives were plump, and the bees were humming tunes older than cities. But as he approached his private chamber, he stopped. Music, faint, wandering, and unmistakably his. But he wasn't playing. He stepped inside slowly. The lyre floated in midair, strings gently vibrating, not violently, not with chaos, but with calm purpose, as if the instrument had something to say and was tired of waiting for permission. Apollo watched, motionless. Koro flapped once, landing on the nearby sill. He tilted his head, then cawed just once. The music stopped. The lyre dropped gently onto its silk-covered pedestal. No crash, just a sigh. Apollo picked it up, plucked a string, nothing unusual. He played a short melody, something he used when he needed Athena to stop lecturing. Still normal. He looked at Koro. "Was that you?" Koro blinked. "You can't play a lyre," Apollo said. "You don't even have thumbs." Koro blinked again. Apollo set the lyre down, poured himself a small cup of honeyed wine, sat. "Maybe it's just the wind," he muttered, "or enchantment drift from Dionysus. He's always misplacing spells." But the lyre played again that night, and the night after, and always when he wasn't in the room. One evening he stayed up pretending to sleep, watched from the shadows. At midnight the lyre rose again. This time it played something different, slower, melancholy, like a lullaby missing its last line. And Koro? He was still, no cause, no hopping, just present. When it ended, the lyre returned to rest. Apollo stepped forward. "Why?" he whispered. Koro turned his head, flew to the lyre, tapped it once with his beak, then flew away. It wasn't until the morning that Apollo remembered something Hermes had said ages ago, half drunk on pomegranate cider. Some instruments remember their owners. Apollo had laughed at the time. "I don't need memories, I make music." But now he wasn't so sure. He asked Feminoi, the ever-enthusiastic oracle. She tried to read the lyre, claimed she heard it whispering. But when he pressed her for specifics, she said, "It wants fig syrup, not helpful." He turned to an elder priest. The man tapped the strings, then declared, "The lyre mourns something." "What does it mourn?" Apollo asked. The priest shrugged. "Maybe it's you." That evening, Apollo sat alone in the garden, lyre in his lap. Koro nearby, grooming one wing with theatrical flair. Apollo spoke softly. You know, there was a time when I sang without thinking. The words just came. The notes just flowed. Now I measure every chord, I polish every phrase, I perform even when no one is watching. He glanced at the raven. Do you ever feel like you're being listened to all the time? Koro, in rare form, hopped closer and gently pecked the lyre. One soft tap, as if to say, yes. Apollo closed his eyes, played a note, then another, then stopped. Let the wind finish the song. Later, as the stars rose and the olive leaves rustled with ancient applause, the lyre floated again. This time, it didn't play. It just hovered, waiting. Maybe, Apollo said aloud, it's not about the song. Maybe it's about the space between. Koro cawed softly. The lyre lowered itself. Apollo smiled just slightly. And in that quiet moment, a god remembered something. Not power, not pride, but presence. And perhaps that's what the lyre had wanted all along, not to speak, but to be held. So now, as we leave the golden garden behind, where music breathes without melody and ravens sleep with one eye open, let your mind soften too. Let the notes fade gently. Let the silence settle like feathers. There's more to come, and not everything that speaks needs words. Of all the sacred trees in Greece, the laurel was Apollo's favourite. Not just because it looked poetic, which it absolutely did, shimmering leaves catching the sun like tiny mirrors, but because of what it meant. The laurel was a reminder, a quiet monument to a love story that ended in roots and branches instead of verses and kisses. But we're not going to talk about that version tonight. Tonight's laurel is a different one, smaller, sassy, and planted without permission behind the Delphi shrine. It grew crooked, bent toward the temple steps, as if trying to eavesdrop. No one knew who planted it, not even the priests. One day it was just there, shrubby, green, innocent-looking, and completely nosy. Femini claimed it moved when people weren't watching. The priest thought she was being dramatic. Then it started humming. Not loudly, not in tune, just soft leafy murmurs like a breeze that had memorized someone's secrets. Apollo was skeptical. A plant? Noisy? But then again, he lived with a raven that mimicked poetry critics and stole figs, so anything was possible. One afternoon, while he strummed his lyre in the courtyard, Koro flew over and landed on the laurel. The leaves rustled like they were applauding, or laughing, or both. Apollo narrowed his eyes. You too? He muttered. Koro cawed once. The laurel rustled again. Apollo stood, approached the plant. What exactly are you hearing? He asked. It did not answer, because it was, despite rumours, still a tree. But the moment his foot touched the soil near its roots, he felt something. A whisper. No words. Just a thought. A presence. Like someone remembering something so old even the memory had wrinkles. He backed away. Right, he said. You stay over there. I'll stay over. Here. The laurel did not disagree. Over the next few weeks, strange things happened. The scrolls stored in the temple began sprouting tiny green vines. Laurel leaves were found pressed between prophecy pages. And worst of all, a message appeared on the temple wall, written in crushed bay leaves and olive oil. It read, "Listen more, shine less." Apollo was not pleased. You think? You're clever, he muttered at the tree. Koro flew over, dropped a beetle on the roots and flapped once. Apollo sighed. I'm surrounded by critics. He tried ignoring it, but the laurel grew taller, more expressive. One night, during a particularly long-winded oracle session, its branches stretched into the window. When Feminoi paused to breathe, a leaf drifted onto her scroll. She picked it up, sniffed it, and declared, "The tree says your husband's lying about the amphorae." The questioner gasped, stormed out. Apollo rubbed his temples. This was not part of the job description. But in the quiet that followed, he realized something. Maybe the laurel wasn't wrong. He had been performing, always on, always golden, but never still. The lyre had tried to tell him, the bird had tried to show him, and now the shrubbery had joined the intervention. It was ridiculous, and maybe exactly what he needed. That evening, Apollo sat beside the laurel, not to lecture, not to banish, just to listen. He closed his eyes, let the wind braid itself through the branches, let the roots press gently into the soil like verses into silence. He breathed, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Koro watching, not with judgment, but with something softer, a kind of permission. "Fine," Apollo said. "You're all poets now." The laurel did not respond, but a single leaf floated into his lap, shaped like a question mark. He smiled, just slightly. "So now, as we leave the temple steps, where gods, birds, and plants stage quiet revolutions, let your mind settle too. Maybe you're carrying too much shine. Maybe you've been speaking when you needed to be still. Let it go. Breathe like leaves do. Let the story root itself in the soil of your thoughts. There's more to come, but for now, just listen. There are banquets, and then there are divine banquets. The former involve plates, forks, eventually, and reasonable amounts of wine. The latter? Well, let's just say they often start with honey-glazed ambrosia and end with a chariot race through the stars. But tonight's story isn't about Olympus. It's about a smaller feast, one that tried very hard to be important and failed in the most delightful way. It started with an invitation. Apollo received it folded in grapevine parchment, sealed with wax shaped like a turtle, no explanation, and scented heavily with cinnamon. Inside it read, "You are cordially summoned to the Feast of the Forgotten Favours, hosted humbly by Dryope, nymph of the lower olive groves." Apollo blinked, then laughed. "Dryope," he muttered. "Didn't she once offer me pickled olives as a bribe to turn her sister into a goat?" Koro cawed once, loudly. "I'm going," Apollo declared, "for the food and the chaos." The Feast of the Forgotten Favours was a yearly tradition, mostly attended by nymphs, minor gods, one confused satyr, and a woman who claimed to be Time's aunt. It was meant to honour all the small, unremembered deeds, like that time someone helped untangle a thread, or passed a message, or offered a fig without asking for one in return. Nice in theory. In practice, it was weird. Apollo arrived fashionably late, which, for a god, meant exactly one mortal lifetime after the first toast. The banquet was held beneath a canopy of twinkling fireflies who had unionized and demanded ambience rights. Lanterns floated in the air. Tables bent under the weight of suspiciously aromatic dishes. There were roasted chestnuts glazed in something no one could name, cheese that hummed softly when you cut it, and a pie that changed flavors based on how many regrets you had. Apollo tried one bite and tasted a goat. "Nope," he said, sliding the plate away. Koro helped himself to a candied cricket. Crunch, blink, satisfaction. The guests mingled. One minor river god offered Apollo a drink made from moonlight and mushroom caps. "It helps you forget songs you haven't written yet," he claimed. Apollo declined. Instead, he wandered to the corner table where the truly mysterious items waited. Those foods no one had dared touch. There was a bowl of whispering lentils, a loaf of bread that rebutted itself, and a glistening thing wrapped in fig leaves, humming softly in a minor key. He picked it up, sniffed, raised an eyebrow. Koro landed on his shoulder. The humming got louder. Apollo turned to Dryope, who was busy arguing with a berry bush. "What is this?" She looked over. "Oh, that. No idea. Hermes left it here centuries ago, said it was a joke." Apollo narrowed his eyes. "I don't like Hermes's jokes." He unwrapped the leaf. Inside was a scroll, a message, but not a divine one. It was handwritten in clumsy ink. Not ancient Greek, just recent, fresh. He read it. "To the one who thinks he knows, may this remind you that knowing is the slowest form of understanding." No signature. Just that. He rolled it back up. Koro cawed. Dryope offered him a pickled date. He took it. The rest of the feast passed in soft confusion. The cheese stopped humming. The moon drink wore off. The pie wept quietly in a dish of its own crust. As the stars blinked above and the fireflies counted their hours, Apollo sat beneath an olive tree, scroll in his hand, mind somewhere else. It wasn't a prophecy, it wasn't poetry, but it lingered, like flavour, like feeling. And you're still here too, seated beside the bread that won't stop buttering itself, listening to the sigh of a breeze through leaves that remember every meal you've ever forgotten. Let your thoughts loosen. Let your memory taste something strange. Not bad, not sweet, just real. A bite of something you didn't know you needed. And as the plates are cleared and the fig leaves folded, we'll carry that scroll with us. Not in our hands, but in the quiet space between knowing and simply being. The temple had many chambers, but only one was known as the Marble Hall, not because it was the largest or most sacred, but because no one quite remembered who built it, or why its walls hummed so softly when no one was inside. Apollo didn't visit it often. It felt too still, even for a god of music. There was a strange texture to its silence, like it was made of ancient breath rather than air, and the echoes there didn't behave like normal ones. They lagged behind a second longer than they should have, like an old friend pretending they hadn't heard you the first time so they could enjoy your voice again. One evening, just before the stars finished buttoning themselves into the night, Apollo found himself wandering toward that hall, Coro flapping lazily behind him, as if only half interested in the journey. The great marble doors were already open. The air inside was cool and heavy, like folded fabric that had been dipped in moonlight. Apollo stepped in. Coro did not. The bird stayed on the threshold, talons curling slightly, head tilted, utterly still. Apollo raised an eyebrow. "Spooked?" he asked. Coro said nothing, just blinked once. Inside the hall, his footsteps made no sound. The walls seemed to muffle everything, as if the space didn't want to be disturbed or remembered. He walked slowly, past empty altars, worn statues, and a long bench carved from one massive block of stone. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not loud, not clear, not words, just the shape of a voice that had forgotten how to speak. He turned. No one there. "All right," he murmured, "either I'm hearing my own metaphors again, or this place is having opinions." He sat on the bench, waited. The whisper came again, like wind moving through memories. He closed his eyes, leaned back, and listened. It felt familiar, the way dreams do when you're almost awake, like a story you once told long before words knew how to rhyme. He stayed there a while. Coro never entered. Eventually the whisper faded. Not gone, just satisfied, as if it had said enough for now. Apollo stood, stretched, and made his way back to the door. Coro gave him a look, that flat, unreadable stare that only birds and grandmothers can truly master. "Yes," Apollo said, "there's something in there." Coro cawed once. "No," Apollo added. It didn't say anything helpful. They walked back in silence. Not awkward, just full. The next morning he returned, this time with his lyre. He didn't play it, just held it, sat quietly. The whisper didn't come, but the stillness did, and it wrapped around him like warm marble, like stone that somehow remembered how to be soft. Later, a priest asked what he found in there. "Not much," Apollo said, "just a memory that forgot its shape." The priest nodded, like that made perfect sense. Maybe it did. That night, Apollo placed a small offering in the hall, 1 olive, 1 feather, and a pebble. No words, no ceremony, just presence. And you're here too, wandering the quietest corners of the myth, sitting beside marble that doesn't speak but listens so well it changes you anyway. Let that stillness rest on your chest. Let it slow your breath. There's no message here to decode, just space and silence, and a whisper that might only make sense in your dreams. The thing about being the god of the sun is that your mornings are non-negotiable, because if you're late, everyone notices. Not just the poets and farmers, but also the crickets, the roosters, and that one overly dramatic rooster in Thebes who flaps angrily if the sun rises more than 4 seconds behind schedule. But one day, just once, Apollo overslept. Not because of rebellion or laziness or divine scandal, but simply because he forgot to set the metaphysical clock that tied his spirit to the sky, and so the sun, too, forgot to rise on time. It was only a few minutes, maybe 10, maybe 20. But in divine time, that's enough for 5 minor prophecies to unravel, 2 marriages to be postponed, and 1 pastry to be severely overbaked. Apollo awoke to the gentle sound of silence being annoyed. Koro was perched directly above him, staring with the intensity of someone who'd waited too long for toast. "What?" Apollo grumbled. Still half tangled in the silk throw, he absolutely didn't steal from Aphrodite's guest room. Koro cawed, loud, sharp, final. Apollo blinked, realized the sky was still pale, not golden, not ready. "Oh no," he muttered, leaping to his feet, cloak trailing behind him like a guilty cloud. He dashed out to the sky chariot stable, which was actually more of a glowing platform carved into celestial light and lined with golden ropes braided by handmaidens made entirely of heat. The horses were unimpressed. They were celestial steeds, sure, but also moody, and they'd already started bickering about who would lead the first lap. Apollo shouted, soothed, yawned, adjusted the sun disk harness, and finally took flight. The sun stuttered into the sky, not in its usual glorious arc, but in a sort of wobbly hop, like a very tired pancake being flipped by someone unsure of their wrist strength. Down below, mortals blinked. Some assumed it was an eclipse. Others took it as a sign to eat dessert before breakfast. Meanwhile, the gods noticed. Artemis sent a dove with a note. Really? Hermes sent a drawing of a snail wearing sunglasses. Dionysus didn't notice at all because he was mid-hangover. But Apollo felt it, the shift, the wobble in the rhythm, and worse. Koro didn't stop reminding him. Every time he picked up the lyre, the bird cawed. Every time he sat to write a new verse, the bird blinked twice, which was his unspoken way of saying, "Shouldn't you be somewhere bright?" Eventually, Apollo sat down beneath the olive tree in the temple courtyard, head in his hands. "I overslept one time," he muttered. Koro cawed softly. "Fine," Apollo said. "Maybe it's more than that. Maybe I'm distracted." And he was. He'd been talking to birds, listening to trees, sitting in halls that whispered. Something had shifted. And while the world still turned and mortals still sang his praises, he, Apollo, felt like his light was slightly off-center. Not dimmer, just sideways. "What if I let it happen?" he asked aloud. Koro tilted his head. "What if, one day, the sun rose without me?" The bird didn't answer, but the silence did. A warm kind of hush, as if the world might still hold together, even if the god of order stepped back for a moment. Apollo leaned back, closed his eyes, let the breeze wash over his skin like soft honey, and whispered, "Maybe the sun deserves a day off too." Koro fluttered to the grass beside him. Didn't speak, didn't judge, just existed. Beside him. That evening, when the sun tucked itself behind the mountains, it didn't sigh or complain. It simply set. On time. Gently. Like it had nowhere else to be. And you? Maybe you've been holding up your own sky for too long. Maybe you've been shining without pause, without rest, without question. Let yourself drift now. Just for tonight. The world will wait, the light will return. But for now, you, like the sun, may sleep in. It's generally understood across all mythological planes that you don't gamble with Zeus. Not because he's particularly good at it, but because he's a sore loser with thunder in his pockets. But on one warm afternoon that smelled of roasted barley and fresh sandalwood, Apollo did just that. Not out of courage, but out of something far more dangerous in a god. Boredom. It began during what was meant to be a short visit to Olympus. A polite check-in, perhaps a touch of divine gossip and a stolen pastry or two from Hera's strictly ceremonial pantry. Apollo had arrived in full golden glow mode. Cloak pressed, curls bouncing, bird on shoulder, ready to charm or irritate depending on the crowd. But when he arrived, he found the court empty save for Zeus, lounging under a fig tree in a robe that had clearly seen better millennia, humming to himself and playing a game with pebbles and lightning sparks on a stone board. "Bored?" Apollo asked, sitting beside him. "Slightly," Zeus admitted. "Want to play?" "What are the rules?" Apollo asked, eyeing the board with suspicion. "There aren't any," Zeus said with a grin, which should have been a warning, but instead Apollo said, "All right, but what's the wager?" Zeus paused, then smiled that mischievous thundercloud smile he reserved for chaos. "If you win, I'll let the sun sleep in again. If I win, you give me the bird." Koro, preening nearby, froze, looked up, and gave Apollo a long, slow blink that was so dripping with disdain it could curdle ambrosia. "Deal," Apollo said. Too fast. Because sometimes even gods act before they think, especially when they have had too much laurel syrup that morning. The game began. It made no sense. Pebbles moved, lightning sparked. Zeus made rules mid-play and changed them again 2 turns later. Koro watched like an unimpressed aunt at a family reunion. Apollo, frustrated but graceful, played along until one single absurdly lucky move involving a triple spark diagonal and something called the grapevine gambit left Zeus cornered. The king of gods blinked. Apollo blinked. Koro didn't blink at all. Zeus frowned. "I believe that means I win," Apollo said smoothly, straightening his robe. Zeus grumbled something about biased game boards and the treachery of birds, but ultimately waved him off with a mildly dramatic thunderclap that singed one of Hera's favourite bushes. "Enjoy your win," he muttered, "but remember, lightning holds grudges." Apollo didn't care. He left Olympus humming, Koro perched high on his shoulder, clearly smug and possibly humming too. They returned to Delphi just in time for sunset, and for once Apollo didn't race it across the sky. He let it dip on its own, unhurried, like a peach dropping from a sleepy tree. That evening he told the story to the priests, who gasped appropriately, and to the nymphs, who pretended not to be impressed, and finally to Koro, who listened carefully before hopping up to the lyre and plucking one string with his beak. It sounded like the start of a song that had waited too long to be sung. "You're welcome," Apollo muttered. Koro blinked. That night Zeus sent a dream, just a quick one, where Apollo was turned into a goat for 15 seconds. Petty but expected. Apollo woke up laughing. He hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Not golden, godly chuckles, but real, surprised laughter, the kind that makes your ribs stretch and your eyes itch just a little. He looked at Koro, who was already awake, probably composing a raven-shaped insult for the next divine gathering, and said, "I think I needed that." Koro didn't reply, just flew to the window ledge and looked out at the fading stars, as if waiting for the next ridiculous chapter to begin. And you? Maybe you've taken yourself too seriously lately. Maybe you forgot that even gods lose bets and even birds can become prizes. Let yourself smile in the dark. Let yourself stretch into absurdity. The sky won't fall. It just winks sometimes. Apollo had received thousands of scrolls in his lifetime. Poems from hopeful mortals, love letters sealed with beeswax, oaths of devotion, and at least one shopping list that accidentally summoned a minor weather spirit. But none were quite like the one that appeared on his lyre one morning, nestled between the strings like it had always belonged there. It wasn't parchment. Not exactly. More like the petal of a tree that hadn't existed in centuries. Smooth, pale, and slightly warm to the touch. When he unrolled it, there were no words, just a faint shimmer, like something had thought about being written, but then changed its mind. He showed it to Koro, who pecked it once, gently, then looked away like he didn't want to get involved. "You're useless," Apollo muttered, but not unkindly. Later that day, after the sun had finished its arc and the olive trees were casting long shadows like sleepy dancers, he sat under the laurel and stared at the scroll again. "All right," he said softly, "if this is one of those mystical tests of worthiness, I'd like to request a hint." The scroll shimmered. Then, slowly, almost shyly, a single word appeared. "Still." Apollo blinked. "Still what?" he asked aloud. "Still open? Still talking? Still trying to understand?" But the scroll didn't answer. Not then. That night he dreamed of silence. Not emptiness, but a full, warm quiet, like the sound of a mother rocking a cradle no one could see. The next morning another word appeared. Listen. To what? He whispered. Koro watched him from the rafters. The lyre hummed softly, even though no one had touched it. He waited. The scroll stayed quiet. Over the next few days, the scroll wrote itself in pieces, never rushed, never more than one word at a time, and only when Apollo wasn't looking directly at it. Sometimes it said breathe, sometimes undo. Once it wrote begin, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One evening, frustrated, he asked it directly, "Are you prophecy, poetry, punishment?" The scroll answered, "Mirror." That stopped him. He sat very still for a long time. Koro fluttered closer and dropped a feather on the scroll. It curled slightly like a nod. Apollo began to write back, not with ink, but with thought, with touch, with presence. He didn't ask questions, just offered moments, a memory, a sigh, a song hummed without words. The scroll absorbed it all. No reply came. But the silence felt different now, less like a riddle, more like a conversation between two things that had forgotten how to speak and were relearning through quiet. Weeks passed. The scroll remained. Its shimmer faded slightly. Its warmth settled. One morning Apollo woke to find it gone. In its place, a single line etched into the marble beneath his lyre. "Now you are writing even when you're not." He touched the words, smiled, and said nothing. Some stories don't ask to be told. They just ask to be felt. And you? Maybe you're holding onto a scroll of your own. Blank. Waiting. Listening. Let it rest beside you now. Let the words arrive slowly, like rain remembering how to fall. It was a simple cup, really, made of dark clay, smooth and wide-mouthed, with a slight chip near the rim that made it seem almost mortal. Apollo had found it at the edge of a forgotten path near the temple gardens, half buried in soil, tucked beside an olive root like an afterthought or a secret that didn't want to be discovered. He picked it up out of curiosity, wiped the dust away. With his sleeve, and expected nothing except maybe a poem to form in his head or a beetle to crawl out in protest. But when he turned it over, a single drop of honey fell from inside, thick, golden, perfectly intact. "That's odd," he muttered and dipped a finger in, tasted it. Sweet, warm, a little spiced, and just faintly laced with thyme, the kind of honey no bee alive could make anymore. He tilted the cup again. More honey, smooth and endless, flowing like it had been waiting for an audience. Koro landed on the nearest branch, cocked his head, and made a sound that Apollo could only interpret as, "Well, now you've done it." Apollo narrowed his eyes. "It's just a cup." Koro blinked. "All right," Apollo sighed. "Maybe not just a cup." Over the next hour he tested it, poured honey into a bowl, then again and again and again. The cup never emptied, not once, not even a tremble of resistance. A gift, he wondered aloud. A trick. A metaphor, the last one felt most likely. Given his recent streak of mystical objects with attitude, he carried it back to the temple, placed it gently on the stone ledge beside his lyre, and waited. But the cup did nothing dramatic. It didn't sing, glow, whisper, or float. It simply sat full, quietly generous. The next day, the oracle asked for a drop of honey to soothe her throat. He gave her a spoonful from the cup. She hummed for 3 days straight, unintentionally forecasting the grain harvest with each note. A week later, a young priest with tired eyes asked for a sip. He hadn't slept in days, plagued by dreams of shouting olives and arguing goats. Apollo offered the cup. The priest drank, then promptly slept for 12 hours beneath a cypress tree and awoke speaking fluent frog. Slowly the cup became a part of the temple, not revered, not enshrined, just known, shared, passed from hand to hand in moments of fatigue, longing, or quiet ache. No one asked where it came from. They just accepted it. One evening Apollo sat with it in his lap, Koro beside him, the moon soft and swollen above. "You know," he said softly, "it never asks anything back." Koro ruffled his feathers. "I'm serious," Apollo continued. "It just gives, and I'm starting to wonder if that's the lesson." The bird said nothing, because sometimes even feathers understand silence better than gods do. Apollo closed his eyes. breathed in the faint sweetness that always seemed to hang around the cup. Not sticky, not cloying, just enough to remind you that comfort didn't need to be loud. He thought of the scroll, the laurel, the whisper in the hall, the game with Zeus, the lyre, the late sunrise, and he smiled. Everything lately has tried to teach me something, he said. But you just are. The cup shimmered faintly, just once, as if agreeing or maybe just adjusting to the starlight. And you? Maybe you've been pouring and forgetting you have your own cup. Maybe you've forgotten that rest is also a form of giving. Maybe you've been full this whole time and didn't know it. Let that sweetness settle now. Not as syrup or sound, but as ease, soft and slow, like honey spreading across warm bread. Nothing to hold, nothing to chase. Just this moment. Just this night. Just the stillness of a cup that never empties and never asks why. There's a sound you sometimes hear when everything else has stopped, when the fire's gone to embers, when the birds have tucked their beaks under their wings, when even the crickets have decided that enough is enough. And it's not quite silence, but not quite presence either. Apollo first noticed it one night beneath the marble arch near the outer shrine, a place that always smelled faintly of lavender and old incense. The stars were particularly bold that evening, crowding the sky like children pushing forward for a story. He'd been humming to himself. Not a song exactly, more like a suggestion of one when he heard it. A reply. Not loud, not immediate, but unmistakable, not an echo. No, because it wasn't his own hum coming back. It was something new, familiar and unfamiliar all at once, like a song you used to know in a language you'd only ever dreamt in. He paused, waited, hummed again, this time a little higher, little longer, and again it answered this strange not echo, following his melody but reshaping it, bending it into something softer, like water deciding to remember music. Koro, perched on the nearby arch, tilted his head but said nothing. Even he seemed unsure whether to interrupt. Apollo tried speaking instead. "Who's there?" he asked, gently, curiously, almost lazily, the way you ask a question you don't expect to be answered. But the sound that came back wasn't his voice. And it wasn't a repeat. It was a word. One single word. Stay. It echoed, yes, but not back at him. Outward, like the stone itself had whispered it to the sky. Apollo stood very still. Not frightened, not startled, just alert. He touched the wall gently, ran his fingers over the ancient grooves, the carved stories worn down by centuries of wind and hands and wonder. "Is this some enchantment?" he murmured. And this time the reply was softer, delayed, a murmur more than a word. "Listen." He did. And in that pause between one breath and the next, he didn't hear anything specific, but he felt something settle inside him, like a note finally falling into place, like the end of a question that didn't need an answer anymore. The next evening he returned. Same spot, same stars, same hum, and again, the not echo responded. Not with words this time, but with warmth, with resonance, with understanding. It became a ritual, not daily, not scheduled, just when he needed it. Those rare nights when even gods feel unsure, when their golden certainty flickers like a candle left too long in a breeze, and each time the not echo replied. Not to guide, not to solve, but simply to say, "I'm here too," and Koro never interfered. He simply waited nearby, quiet and present, like a sentinel who knew this was not his part of the story. One night Apollo brought his lyre, played 3 notes, paused, and let the not echo take the 4th. They finished a song together that no one else would ever hear, and when it ended, he whispered, "Thank you." The not echo replied with silence, but it was the kind that glowed at the edges, the kind that felt like a hand resting gently on your shoulder from the past. And you? Maybe there's a part of you that's been humming into the void, hoping for something, an answer, a mirror, a hand reaching back through the quiet. Maybe this is your not echo, not to speak for you, but to stay with you through the stillness, through the space, through the moment between this chapter and the next. Every city, no matter how ancient or divine, has its own rhythm, its own little pulse hiding beneath the polished stones and echoing colonnades. And Delphi was no different, though most knew it for prophecy and gods and oracles. There was one little corner few ever mentioned, a stretch of sun-warmed path behind the lower temple walls, where a tiny market gathered once every full moon. It wasn't an official thing. No one announced it. No horns blew, no doves flew in loops with scrolls tied to their feet, and yet each time the moon was fat and golden, just slightly too round to believe, the stalls would appear. Always slightly crooked, always in the same spot. Apollo stumbled upon it by accident, as most strange truths are found. He had been following Coro, who had been following a particularly aromatic string of fig skins tossed by a tipsy scribe. They turned a corner, past an abandoned arch, and suddenly, there it was. The market of almosts. It didn't sell regular things. Of course not. The first stall offered half-finished dreams, curled up like cinnamon rolls under glass domes. "This one," the vendor said, holding up a flickering orb, "is the dream of a baker who almost became a musician." The next stall sold questions without answers, stacked like scrolls, priced in memories. Apollo passed by a table full of jars that claimed to contain the scent of places you almost visited, and another where a woman in a moss-coloured shawl sold shadows that used to belong to other people. He wasn't sure if he should laugh or be reverent, so he did neither. He simply walked, quietly, as though trying not to wake the dust. Coro perched on a post and preened unfazed, until he spotted a dish filled with roasted crickets, and promptly made himself at home. Apollo, meanwhile, stopped at a stall covered in soft cloths, run by an old man with a voice like worn paper. "What do you sell?" Apollo asked. "Almosts," the man replied. "Miss things, might-have-beens, nearlies." "And what would I want with those?" Apollo asked, tilting his head. The man shrugged. "Depends on what you've already forgotten." That night, Apollo bought one thing, a single folded letter labelled unsent. It smelled faintly of rosemary and something sad. He never opened it, just kept it tucked into the inner fold of his robe, near his heart, not out of fear, but out of respect. The market vanished by morning, as always. No stalls, no footprints, just the memory of a path that didn't used to be there, and a whisper of fig skin in the breeze. In the days that followed, Apollo found himself thinking of it often, especially the jars of scent, the unanswered questions, and the woman who offered a shadow that looked oddly familiar. One night, he returned to the spot beneath the full moon, hoping, wondering, but the space was empty, as if it had never existed. He sat on the ground, pulled out the letter, and held it in his hand, still unopened, still scented with quiet. "Almosts," he murmured, and suddenly the word didn't feel like failure. It felt like possibility, like a doorway you pass 100 times before finally stepping through. And you've got your own almosts, don't you? Letters you never sent, songs you never finished, places you nearly went before something changed. Maybe they still live somewhere, folded and waiting, like that market under the moon. Let them rest beside you now, not to open, not to fix, just to hold, lightly, until your breath finds their rhythm again. It was just one olive. One stubborn, quietly confident little olive clinging to a branch at the very top of the oldest tree in the temple grove, the kind of tree that creaked when no wind blew, that held the sky's attention without asking. Most olives came and went with the season, dropping in dignified silence, feeding birds, staining tunics, occasionally starring in a metaphor, but not this one. This one just stayed, week after week, month after month. It wasn't larger than the others, or shinier, or particularly special looking, it just refused. And for reasons Apollo himself couldn't quite explain, it bothered him. "You're not a metaphor," he muttered once, standing below it, arms crossed. "You're not profound, you're just dramatic," Coro, watching from a nearby fig branch, cawed in what sounded suspiciously like agreement. Apollo tried ignoring it, which worked as well as ignoring a pebble in your sandal, or a note stuck in your head, or a raven with opinions. Eventually, he sent one of the temple boys to climb the tree. The boy returned an hour later, scratched, winded, and oliveless. "It won't come off," he said, bewildered. "I touched it and it pulsed." Apollo frowned. Pulsed? Like it knew, the boy whispered. From that point on, no one touched the olive. It became a kind of inside joke. A myth within the myth. The immortal olive, they called it. Apollo started leaving offerings beneath it. Tiny things, mostly absurd. One day it was a ribbon from his cloak. Another time it was a seashell that looked vaguely like a harp. Nothing happened, but he kept doing it anyway. A strange ritual with no instruction manual. The seasons shifted, leaves fell, regrew, birds came and went. But the olive remained, and one morning, while sitting beneath the tree with Koro perched quietly beside him, Apollo whispered, "Why do you stay?" Of course. The olive didn't answer, not directly, but the breeze stirred the leaves in a way that almost sounded like breathing, and for the first time Apollo didn't feel annoyed or curious or even expectant. He just felt mirrored. Later that evening the oracle passed by and said without looking up, "It falls when you're not watching." "What?" Apollo asked. But she kept walking, eyes distant, smile unreadable. "It's already fallen, probably," she added over her shoulder. He didn't know if she meant in the past, the future, or the moment he blinked. He stood under the tree and stared at it for an hour straight. The olive still clung resolute. He blinked, cursed under his breath, and the olive was gone just like that. No sound, no rustle, no dramatic flare, just not there anymore. He searched the grass, the branches, even asked Koro to do a sweep. Nothing, as if it had never been, or perhaps had always been somewhere else entirely. Apollo sat back down, stared up at the now empty spot and smiled. "Well played," he murmured, and in the silence that followed the breeze answered, not with a message but with the gentlest shrug. "And you? Maybe you've got your own olive, something you've stared at too long, waited for too hard, something that never arrived when you wanted it to. But maybe, just maybe, it's already fallen when you weren't looking. Maybe it didn't need to be caught, just noticed, just remembered. So let it fall quietly, invisibly, gently into your dream tonight." There was once a lute tucked into the corner of the Delphi Temple's old music room, where sunlight spilled in thin golden lines across cracked tiles and forgotten scrolls, the kind of room that always smelled faintly of dust, cedar and distant applause. Apollo didn't use that room much anymore. It had once been his favourite, back when melodies spilled from him like laughter. But now he preferred quieter spaces, places where birds spoke and trees gave unsolicited advice. But the lute remained, untouched, except for one afternoon when he wandered in, half distracted, humming a tune he couldn't quite name. The lute sat exactly where he'd left it, a little crooked, one string missing, one string too tight, the others somewhere in between disinterested and offended. He picked it up, strummed once, winced. "That was rude," he muttered. The lute, of course, made no apology. He tuned one peg, it snapped back out, tuned another. It groaned. "You've aged poorly," he said, narrowing his eyes. Koro, watching from a shelf above, offered a low caw that sounded suspiciously like a giggle. Apollo tried again. Tune, pluck, tune, sigh, tune. Question his purpose, tune. Threaten to melt the instrument, tune, apologize to it. By sunset, the lute still sounded like it had swallowed a frog mid-aria. Defeated, he set it down and left. The next day it called to him. Not literally, but in that way old things sometimes do when they know you've almost given up on them. He returned, plucked a string, it twanged. Slightly better, still wrong, but better. He didn't try to fix it that day. Just played what it gave him. Odd notes out of key, beautiful in their disobedience. The melody made no sense, but it stayed with him, like a whisper stuck in the folds of his robe. Over the next few weeks, the lute became a companion of sorts. Always off, always honest, Apollo started composing around its flaws, writing songs that bent around the notes that refused to be tamed, and slowly, strangely, he began to love it. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. One evening, a young student asked, "Why don't you just make a new one?" Apollo smiled, looked at the lute resting on his, lapped like a sleepy animal, and said, "Because this one has learned me." The student blinked, confused, and wandered off to copy hymns, Koro flew down, pecked one string gently, and the lute hummed back, soft, content, off-key, and exactly right. Sometimes Apollo would play for hours, never correcting, never striving, just exploring, letting the lute speak in the crooked voice it had earned. And somehow the temple felt fuller, as if the imperfect notes filled cracks no perfect chord ever could. And you, maybe there's something in you or near you that doesn't quite fit, something a little out of tune, a little bent, a little unlike the others. Don't throw it away, don't silence it. Maybe it's your lute. Maybe it holds the song that only you can hear, the one that doesn't need to impress or explain, only exist. So let it play tonight, softly, however it wants, because sometimes the most beautiful music is just the sound of something trying. It started as a joke, really, a small temple gift from a visiting artisan who claimed the threads were spun under a new moon by silent spiders raised on starlight. Apollo had accepted it with a smile and a nod, assuming it would end up draped over a bench or folded into a forgotten storage shelf, like so many other ceremonial offerings. But something about the fabric tugged at him, not literally, though the weave did have a slight spring to it, as if it was never fully at rest. It was deep blue, like twilight melted into thread, and it shimmered faintly, not in a magical way, just like it had recently remembered something important and was still glowing from it. He draped it over a low couch in his private chamber and thought nothing more of it. Until the dreams began, the first night, he heard his name. Not the way mortals said it with awe or the way priests sang it with reverence, but the way his mother had once said it, soft and tired and amused all at once. Apollo, drawn out like a lullaby, too old for melody. He sat up in bed, blinking, heart still, but the room was empty. Koro was asleep near the window, one eye half open in case a midnight snack wandered by. Apollo looked at the blanket. It hadn't moved, but it glowed ever so gently, like the moonlight had slipped beneath its threads and curled up to rest. The next night it whispered another name. Not his this time. Someone he hadn't thought about in years. A boy from long ago who once tried to steal fireflies for him in a clay jar. Who failed. Who laughed. Who vanished into time without ever saying goodbye. Apollo lay still, listening, not sad, not startled. Just still. By the fourth night the blanket spoke often. Not aloud, not in words, but in warmth, in weight, in the way it held him. Names came like fireflies themselves. Soft, flickering, incomplete, but real. Names he'd forgotten, names he'd chosen to forget, names of lovers, rivals, friends, enemies who were never truly enemies. 100 lifetimes worth of moments stitched into fabric, and each night it remembered one more. Some nights he wept, not from sorrow, but from that strange ache you feel when something old returns to you unchanged, as if time had waited, as if distance never mattered. Koro never commented, but he began sleeping closer, sometimes with one feather resting on the edge of the blanket, perhaps to remember, perhaps to add his own name to the fabric's memory. Apollo never told the others about it, not because it was secret, but because it was sacred. One night the blanket grew heavy, not unpleasant, just full of names, full of stories, full of breath and memory and pause. He wrapped himself in it and whispered, "If I forget again, remind me." The blanket pulsed gently, and he slept deeper than he had in 1,000 years. And you? Maybe you've forgotten a name, not someone else's, but your own. The name you had before titles and tasks and to-do lists took over. Maybe you once called yourself something softer. Maybe it's still there, folded somewhere between your ribs and your last deep breath. Let the night wrap her around you now like that blanket, full of names you didn't know you still carried, full of love you never meant to leave behind. There's no need to remember them all. Not tonight. Just rest, and let the blanket do the remembering for you. The statues never moved, of course. Not in the way you'd expect. Not in dramatic clanks or cracking stone or cinematic groans. They were just there, in their usual places, frozen in glory, carved expressions forever trapped between knowing and indifference. But one late afternoon, when the sun had just begun to bleed its orange thoughts across the temple's western wall, Apollo swore he saw it. A shift, a twitch, a slight adjustment of gaze in the corner of his vision. It was the statue of Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, normally staring nobly toward the horizon, like she was waiting for a ship that only metaphor could sail, but now she was looking slightly left, just a hair, just enough. He stopped walking, turned to face her fully, and of course she was still again. Chiseled and calm, Koro landed nearby, cocked his head, and squinted with mild suspicion. Apollo said nothing, but the thought clung to him like sandalwood smoke. He visited the other statues, Athena in her warlike pride, Hermes mid-stride with that familiar smirk, even the one of himself, which he had always found a little too proud in the chin. None seemed changed, but something was different, not in the stone but in the space between, like air that had learned to remember. The next morning, the young acolyte who cleaned the marble each week said casually, "Strange. I thought the statue of Euterpe used to look at the fountain." "She still does," Apollo replied. "Not quite," the boy said, and wandered off, humming an unfinished melody. Later that week, a visiting philosopher stood before the sculpture of Nike and remarked, "Curious, she seems more thoughtful now." "She's the goddess of victory," someone replied. "She doesn't think, she wins." "Yes, but still," the philosopher muttered and took a step back. Apollo observed in silence. Each day, more people noticed subtle shifts. A hand once outstretched, now slightly lowered. A head once held high, now inclined just enough to be listening. Not all of them, not always, just sometimes, and always when no one could quite prove it. Koro began hopping between pedestals like he was conducting a survey, occasionally pecking gently at a toe or a robe's edge, as if checking for pulse. Apollo didn't try to solve it. Not really. He simply watched, listened, wondered if maybe, just maybe, the statues weren't changing at all. Maybe he was. Maybe perception itself had softened, like old bread toasted into something new. One night he sat beneath the statue of Mnemosyne, mother of the muses. Her eyes were closed in sculpted stillness, but her lips, he thought, looked less closed than before. He rested his head against the pedestal, closed his eyes, and whispered, "If you ever decide to speak, I promise I'll listen." The wind rustled the olive leaves nearby, soft and slow, and he swore, just for a moment, that the stone beneath him was warm. And you? Maybe there's something around you that hasn't moved in years, something familiar, something still, something you pass without noticing. Maybe it hasn't changed. Maybe you have. Let yourself see it again tonight, without needing proof, without needing answers, just wonder, quiet and round like the moon above the temple. Because sometimes the world waits until you're drowsy enough to notice it's always been alive. No one planted it, no one watered it. No one even remembered there being enough soil on that slope behind the temple where sunlight barely touched, and goats occasionally slipped just for drama. But one morning it was there, an orchard, fully grown, quiet, unapologetic, as if it had always existed and everyone else had simply forgotten to notice. Apollo first heard about it from a breathless attendant who came running mid-scroll delivery. "My lord," she gasped. "Trees." "Yes," he replied without looking up. "We've had those for a while." "Not these," she insisted, and he followed mostly out of curiosity, partly because Koro had already flown ahead as if he knew something worth knowing was waiting. The orchard was absurdly complete. Rows of evenly spaced trees, bark still damp as if they'd only just yawned into being, leaves full, fruits glistening with the kind of dew that poets usually invent. Each tree bore a different fruit, and none of them were quite right, not in the usual way. One grew what looked like plums except when bitten into. They tasted like memories of swimming. Another bore golden pears that fizzed slightly on the tongue and made you forget your least favourite cousin for exactly an hour. One tree even offered pale green orbs that hummed like lyres if held close enough to the chest. "This is either divine or deeply irresponsible," Apollo murmured. Koro landed on one such tree and immediately pecked a fruit, froze, blinked, and then chuckled in bird language, which sounded suspiciously like the first three notes of an unfinished lullaby. Apollo plucked one and held it, warm, vibrating slightly, as if it recognized him. He didn't eat it, Not yet. Just placed it gently in his robe's pocket and continued through the rows. No two fruits repeated. No two trees the same shape. Yet somehow the orchard felt cohesive, designed, like a song with no chorus but perfect rhythm. As word spread, people came to visit, not in crowds, just softly, reverently, the way one visits old friends or unexpected kindnesses. The oracle touched a peach and wept. A child hugged a tree and forgot his fear of the dark. A donkey sniffed a glowing citrus and promptly fell asleep mid-chew. Apollo watched it all quietly, not intervening, not claiming, just witnessing. Each evening he returned alone and walked the rows in silence. Koro perched above, sometimes singing in half syllables, sometimes not at all. One night he finally tasted the fruit he had kept in his pocket. It dissolved like stardust on his tongue, and for a brief, impossible moment he remembered the face of a mortal poet he hadn't thought of in centuries. The exact curve of her smile, the way she tapped her fingers on stone when thinking, the last thing she said before vanishing into legend. "You never looked away," he whispered. No one answered, but the trees swayed gently, as if nodding, as if listening. No one ever found the orchard's roots, and one day, weeks later, it vanished as quietly as it had appeared. No fading, no withering, just gone, like a page turned, leaving only the scent of fruit and the echo of unsung songs in the soil. And you? Maybe there's a part of you that suddenly bloomed without permission, an idea, a longing, a memory that arrived too fast, too full, too beautiful to explain. Don't try to prune it, don't search for its roots, just let it be here. For tonight, let it surround you like that impossible orchard, fragrant and strange and softly glowing in the back of your thoughts, not asking anything of you except rest. It was barely noticeable at first, just a single feather, pale grey with the faintest streak of gold, resting at the edge of the courtyard fountain where time often paused to watch its own reflection. Apollo saw it one morning while sipping watered wine and pretending not to be watching Koro steal grapes from a passing tray. The feather didn't belong to Koro. He was darker, shinier, more iridescent and annoyingly self-aware. And yet this one had a certain familiarity to it. Something gentle, like a thought left unfinished. Apollo bent to pick it up, and just as his fingers neared, it rose, slowly, deliberately, not in a gust or whirl, but with the certainty of a memory returning from exile. It hovered eye level, turned once in the air, then drifted higher as if remembering a promise. "All right," Apollo said softly. "We're doing that today." He followed, not running, not chasing, just walking. With the kind of curiosity that hums beneath your ribs, the feather floated just ahead, always close, never within reach, past the columns, through the garden, along the path near the statue of the laughing lion that only roared during eclipses. No one else seemed to notice. Priests walked past, attendants carried scrolls, a dog napped in the shade of a fig tree. But to Apollo the world had narrowed into a single slow-moving upward drift. Eventually the feather paused mid-air above the amphitheatre steps, hovered, spun, and dropped straight up. Not down, up. Like the laws of gravity had politely excused themselves for the afternoon. Apollo laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it made no sense and still felt perfectly timed. Koro appeared a moment later, squawked once and gave a look that clearly said, "Don't blame this one on me." Apollo climbed the steps slowly, half expecting to find a portal or a trick or maybe just a very persuasive breeze. But there was nothing there, just sky, soft and waiting. He sat down, stared upward, and waited, not for answers, just for stillness. And after some time something shifted. Not in the world, but in him. Like a feather turning mid-fall, he remembered a boy from centuries past who'd once asked, "Why do feathers fall?" And Apollo had answered, "Because the sky doesn't need to hold everything." But now, watching that upward motion, he thought maybe the sky does hold everything, just not all at once. Maybe some things returned slowly, one feather at a time. He smiled, placed a small offering on the step beside him, a fig, a whisper, a breath, and whispered, "Wherever you're going, carry this with you." The breeze stirred slightly, and he didn't need to see the feather to know it had heard him. "And you?" Maybe you've been waiting for something to land, something to arrive in the usual way. But tonight, let yourself believe that some feathers fall up, some messages drift the other way, and not everything that leaves is lost. Maybe something you once let go is gently rising now, circling back, waiting to be seen again. Not caught, not claimed, just acknowledged. Let that quiet carry you now, soft and slow, like the promise of a sky that always listens. It was meant to be a simple meal. Barley stew, a pinch of thyme, a sliver of goat cheese floating lazily on top. The kind of food meant for comfort, not ceremony. Apollo had risen early, restless, and decided to cook himself. Not because he was particularly good at it, but because sometimes even gods needed to hear the sound of a spoon against a clay pot to remember they existed. The kitchen was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of firewood and the soft flutter of corals. Wings as he searched for crumbs with dramatic flair. Apollo stirred the stew gently, slowly, more out of habit than hunger, and then, ever so softly, the spoon stirred back. Not violently, not jarringly, just a gentle nudge, like a sleepy hand shifting under a blanket. Apollo blinked, looked at the spoon, then at Koro, who gave an unimpressed blink in return. "No games," Apollo muttered, and stirred again, this time watching closely. Again, the spoon pushed slightly against his hand, like a child nudging a parent's arm mid-story. He set it down, took a step back, arms crossed. "Explain yourself," he said to the inanimate object. It did not explain, but the stew bubbled once. Thoughtfully, as if considering its options, he poked it with a fork. Nothing. Poked it with a ladle. Still nothing. Finally, he picked up the spoon again and spoke. "If you got something to say, say it." The spoon twisted lightly in his grip, then began stirring on its own. Slow, wide circles moving through the broth like it knew a secret recipe that had never been written down. Apollo stood still, holding it, letting it guide the rhythm, and found himself humming along, a melody he hadn't meant to recall, something from a mortal village long gone, sung by women with cracked hands and men with flour on their sleeves. He remembered a winter night when he'd passed through unnoticed, stood in the doorway while they cooked, and listened to the sound of spoons and voices rising together like prayer. This was that sound, reborn in barley and thyme. He stirred and remembered, and the spoon moved like it too was remembering. When the stew was done, he tasted it and gasped, not from spice or heat, but from memory. It tasted like something he didn't know he missed. He ladled it into small bowls and carried them to the temple steps, placing one near the sleeping lion statue, one by the old fountain, one under the olive tree that used to hold a stubborn fruit. Each place welcomed it like a returning traveller. Koro watched, then flew down to eat from a bowl with dramatic, unnecessary pecking. Apollo sat down, spoon still warm in his hand, and whispered, "Thank you." The spoon gave no reply, but didn't need to. Some tools, like some moments, simply remember what we forget. And you? Maybe something small in your life is stirring back. An old recipe, a scent from childhood, a dusty song you haven't sung out loud in years. Maybe it's nudging you, gently, slowly, waiting for you to notice. So let it stir you tonight. Not to rush or wake, but to remember, soft and slow, until even your breath hums like barley in a warm clay bowl. It sat in the temple's west hallway, wedged between two mismatched columns and half-shaded by a curtain no one had touched in decades. The mirror wasn't grand. No golden frame, no polished silver, no dramatic aura of prophecy. It was simple, square, with edges slightly worn from fingers long forgotten, and yet people avoided it, not out of fear, but out of something quieter, like guilt. Apollo first noticed it one cloudy afternoon, walking alone, humming a half-song to himself and feeling oddly heavy, not sad, just overfull, like his thoughts had eaten too much and needed a nap. He passed the mirror, paused, and caught a glimpse, not of his reflection, not exactly, but of something just beside it, as if someone had been standing behind him and walked away the moment he turned. He stepped closer, looked in, saw himself. But not as he expected. not radiant or composed, not the divine version sculpted into fountains or etched onto votive coins. This version had tired eyes, soft creases near the mouth, a curl out of place. He touched the glass. It didn't feel cold, didn't shimmer or ripple. It just stayed, honest. "You're rude," he whispered to it. The mirror didn't blink, didn't laugh, didn't offer comfort, just stared back as if saying, "This is what's here." For days he avoided it, took different corridors, distracted himself with festivals, archery, poetry, riddles with oracles who always won. But eventually he returned, late at night, with Koro asleep on his shoulder and the moon caught in his robes. This time he looked longer, let the silence thicken around him like soup left on the fire too long. The mirror still showed him, but differently again. Now he was smiling, not a wide grin, but a tiny one, the kind you give yourself when no one else is around. "Why?" he asked softly, and the reflection didn't change, didn't answer, and yet he felt it, a quiet nudge in his ribs, not the truth he expected, but the truth he needed, not judgment, just witnessing. The next evening, a young student stood before the mirror and frowned. "It won't show me anything," he said. "Maybe you're not ready," Apollo replied. And the boy looked confused, but didn't ask more. Day by day, the mirror stayed, still and silent, yet ever-changing, showing people not what they feared, but what they'd forgotten, how they wept without reason, how they laughed without purpose, how they stood before their own reflection and finally saw someone real. One night, Apollo sat before it cross-legged, spooning warm figs into a bowl with one hand and resting his chin on the other. "I don't hate you," he said aloud. "I think I was just surprised." The mirror didn't flinch, just softened slightly around the edges, like fog curling in, like the way your name sounds when someone you love says it slowly. And you? Maybe you've avoided your own mirror lately. Not the glass one, but the moments that show you who you've become when no one's watching. Maybe it's time to sit beside that version of you. No judgment, no edits, no filters, just soft, sleepy recognition, just quiet truth, folding itself around you like a blanket that never asks you to change, only to rest. No one remembered where it came from, not even the oldest oracle who once claimed she'd seen the moon cry. But the bell had always hung there, in the little archway that led nowhere, tucked between two storage rooms filled with cracked amphorae and olives that had given up. It was small, brass or maybe bronze, with carvings so faint they looked like someone had once traced them with a sleepy fingertip. And though the wind passed through that hall every day, the bell never moved, not even a twitch. Not when storms howled or festivals roared, or when Koro decided to test its patience with a series of increasingly loud calls. "It's decorative," someone had once shrugged. "Symbolic, probably." But Apollo had always felt differently, not out of knowledge, but instinct, like the way you just know which stair creaks or which fig is about to fall. Then one night, after a particularly slow day filled with half-finished scrolls and a loaf of bread that refused to toast, Apollo slept deeply and dreamed, not a vision, not a message, just a dream. He was walking the hallway barefoot, the stone cool underfoot, and the bell rang once, light, clear, not loud but sharp enough to stop the air. He turned, saw it still swaying gently, as if stirred by something older than wind. He stepped toward it, reached out, and as his fingers brushed the brass, he woke up, heart still humming. "Strange," he muttered, sitting up in bed, the room silent, the air normal, but he could still feel it. That tone, that shimmer of sound like a memory he hadn't lived. He asked Koro, who blinked once and returned to preening unbothered. The next night it happened again. The dream, the walk, the bell. This time it rang twice, and he didn't wake until he touched it. This went on for weeks. The bell always in the dream, always silent in the real world. He began to anticipate it, look forward to it. The gentle echo, the way the air changed around it, soft and reverent, as if even his sleep bowed its head. He never told anyone. Not because it was secret, but because some things become lighter when held. Quietly in those nights, the bell began to ring more clearly, like it had found its voice again, Or maybe Apollo had simply learned how to hear. Once, in the dream, a child stood beside him, unfamiliar, luminous, holding a lyre too large for her hands. "It only rings when you're listening," she said, and he nodded without speaking. In the waking world, he walked past the bell every morning, touched it lightly, never expecting a sound, and yet, sometimes, just sometimes, he felt something stir inside him at that moment, a calm, a knowing, like a dream reaching back. One day, a visiting traveller asked about the little brass thing in the archway. "Does it ever ring?" Apollo smiled softly. "Only when you forget you're asleep. And you? Maybe there's a bell in your life too. Silent, still, unnoticed, but waiting for the hush, for the softness, for the dream in which your heart steps lightly and listens. Let it ring tonight, not loudly, not to wake you, but to wrap around you like a lullaby that never needed words, like a whisper in a language your bones already understand." They weren't much to look at, just a pair of sandals, worn smooth at the soles, straps slightly frayed, the leather a shade somewhere between forgotten parchment and late autumn leaf. They hung near the servants' entrance, tucked beside a jug of olive oil no one touched and a broom whose bristles had long accepted retirement. Apollo noticed them during a rare moment of actual cleaning, when Koro had knocked over a stack of old hymn scrolls and then blamed a breeze that hadn't existed in 2 weeks. The sandals looked like they belonged to someone long gone, the kind of someone who once hummed to themselves while carrying water, who knew every creak in the temple floor and never asked questions. He picked them up, expecting dust, maybe a spider or two, but they were clean, untouched by time, as if the past had politely decided to leave them alone. He set them down, stared at them, then, on a whim, slid his feet in. They fit, not perfectly, but with the kind of ease that felt familiar. Not like they'd been made for him, but like they'd already forgiven him. He walked a few steps. No squeak, no scuff, no pinch, just a quiet softness, like stepping on memories that didn't want to wake. Koro tilted his head, unimpressed, and fluttered up to perch on the nearest beam. Watching with narrowed eyes, Apollo walked out into the courtyard, sandals tapping gently against the stones, and felt lighter, not in weight, but in worry, in thought, in that deep echo of "should I be somewhere else?" that followed him everywhere. The sandals carried him through the temple grounds, past places he hadn't visited in months, the cracked sundial, the neglected herb garden, the hidden bench behind the laurel grove. He walked for hours, never tiring, never stopping, each step strangely effortless, as if the earth itself leaned in to make the journey shorter. That night he dreamed of roads he hadn't taken. Not regrets, just possibilities. Lives that whispered softly from far-off forks in time. He woke with the sandals beside his bed, untouched, unmoved, but warm, like they'd waited patiently. He wore them again the next day, and the day after, never speaking about them, never answering when asked. "New sandals?" "Old ones," he'd reply, "older than you think." And they never wore out. Never tore, never thinned, never asked for repair. They just kept going, step after step, and slowly something inside him began to mirror them. His thoughts travelled longer without growing tired. His heart wandered further without getting lost. The sandals never led him astray, even when he closed his eyes. And one afternoon, on a hill far beyond the temple walls, he sat down, took them off, placed them side by side beneath a tree that smelled like lavender and lightning, and whispered, "Thank you for carrying what I couldn't." Then walked back barefoot, slower now, but still light. And you? Maybe you've had your own pair of sandals, an old habit, a quiet ritual, something simple that carried you farther than you realized. Maybe it's still there, waiting, soft, unworn, ready to hold your weight without asking questions. Let it come to you tonight, not with fanfare, not with pressure, just with ease, with rest, with the hush of footsteps you no longer need to take. No one remembered who wove it first. Maybe it was Clotho, one of the Fates, or maybe just an old woman with soft hands and stories too long to tell in daylight. But the thread had always existed, looped quietly in a cedarwood box beneath the temple steps. Apollo found it during renovations he hadn't asked for, when someone lifted a slab and called out, "My lord, there's something here!" It was pale gold, coiled neatly, warm to the touch, and impossibly long. "How far does it stretch?" he asked. And no one answered. Not because they didn't know, but because they understood they never could. He picked it up, expecting weight, but it was featherlight, like breath captured in silk. He tied one end to a fig branch near the courtyard and began walking, unspooling the thread behind him. Not quickly, not purposefully, just following wherever his feet felt softest. It trailed after him like a second thought, winding through hallways, looping gently past mosaics of forgotten heroes, curling once around Koro's perch, who blinked twice and let it be. It never tugged, never tangled, never snapped. It simply continued, patient and sure, as if it had always known the path better than he did. Some days he followed it up hills, into groves, past streams where frogs hummed lullabies older than the stars, and each evening he returned, the thread always taut, always ready for tomorrow. One morning he asked, "Is this thread leading me somewhere?" And the oracle, chewing a fig and not looking up, replied, "Maybe it's leading you back." "Back where?" he asked. "Wherever you thought you lost yourself," she said, and then offered him the rest of the fig. Weeks passed. The thread grew no shorter, no thicker, no older. Apollo stopped trying to measure it, stopped wondering about its end. He simply wove it through the temple like breath through a body, until its presence became part of the rhythm of things, like sunrise or silence or the scent of olives warming on stone. One night, just before sleep, he tied the end around his wrist, not tight, just enough, and whispered, "Hold me if I drift too far." And in the morning he awoke with the thread still there, pulsing softly, like a heartbeat outside of time. And you? Maybe you've got a thread too, something invisible but steady, something that doesn't pull but patiently follows. Maybe it's memory or hope, or just the quiet way you keep going even when you don't know why. Let that thread wrap around you now, not as a tether, but as a comfort. Not to bind, but to remind. You've always been carried, you've always been followed by something gentle, and it doesn't end. Not here, not tonight, not ever.